Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Sadhaka. I'm here today with Kate Werning, who is a yoga teacher and social justice activist and organizer. This is actually the fourth interview of a 5-day video series exploring the intersection of spirituality, yoga practice, and politics and our current situation. Kate and I are going to talk today about that intersection and also about kind of where we're at politically from a kind of broader standpoint and how we can engage from a practical or a practitioner's kind of point of view. So with that, hi, Kate. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and happy that you are making this conversation happen.
Thank you. Yes, I feel like the inspiration around this has really been to try to look at political engagement and this kind of conversation as a part of our practice, as something that is a part of our personal sadhana. So we were talking a little bit before the interview started about a story that you thought really highlighted this intersection of yogic teaching and activism. So do you want to take us a little bit do you want to tell that story?
I would love to because, I'm super grateful that you're doing this series. And I have spent the past couple of years in conversation with yoga instructors and practitioners as to how does this practice relate to our politics. And for me, I came up as an organizer and actually later found yoga practice. So I had the political and social engagement piece first.
Right.
And then I was becoming constantly exhausted. My immune system was shot. I felt totally overwhelmed by the scale of need in our world. And my body was carrying that quite literally, like just in total overwhelm mode. And as I started to teach, I found the practice, I took a teacher training, I started to teach, and I sort of would have this disjointed experience of like going to the south side of my city, working with undocumented youth, young people who were brought to this country by their parents when they were like toddlers or under 5 years old, and grew up in this country undocumented, but didn't even have any memory or volition of crossing the border, right? Because they were brought with their families. And so we would do marches, and we worked for immigration reform and policy change and to stop deportations of young kids' parents. And I would do that work, which was so much a part of my enactment of ahimsa and satya in the world. And then I would drive across town to the yoga studio where I taught that I absolutely loved and adored. That was mostly white folks, mostly people who had never met those other folks that I had just come from. And I really struggled with how do I make my class and my teaching style authentic to the fact that my yoga practice, my commitment to ahimsa and satya is so lived out outside those studio doors and is so critical to my approach to this practice, yet also create a space that would be welcoming to a variety of political orientations walking in the door. And so I struggled with that and would kind of experiment a little bit with how I could share my values in a way that felt accessible and not alienating to people. And then I had this experience where I began working with Citizen Well, which is an organization that very deliberately engages the well-being community in social justice work and political engagement for the well-being of all. And I had this trip where myself and the director, Carrie Kelly, met in Baltimore. We met there because we were going to go run a workshop at a women's conference. And when we arrived in Baltimore, it was the exact same weekend that Freddie Gray, who was a young black man, was thrown into the back of a police van and driven recklessly around town until his spine was broken and he died. Oh. So we arrived in Baltimore, a city I've never been to before. It was one of the most horrific police murders, although there have been many, of the past couple of years. And when people heard this story, it was so horrifying. And that was the same weekend that there was like uprising that happened in the local community there. there was all this dramatization because there was a CVS. I don't know if you remember this, but there was like a CVS that the windows were broken and there was like a limited amount of looting that happened there. And so there were these images plastered on the TV across the country of like the fire in the CVS, right? And people were horrified and afraid. And the national portrayal was that like Baltimore was in like total upheaval. And so here are Carrie and I, like randomly present in this city that we don't know. And when I got there, I didn't really know what to do. So I took a walk and I found a Whole Foods and I was like, I'm going to get some groceries for, our hotel room and figure out what we're going to do. And I have this really distinct memory of sitting in the Whole Foods and looking outside the window and just seeing tanks lined up of the National Guard. And I'm like sitting in this Whole Foods eating my little tofu snack. And it was such a wild confrontation of like power and force coming in to that community, the totally justified and rightful grief and outrage and anger of the folks who had lost a son, a member of their community to police violence. The crackdown on that. And then also of my own privilege of like showing up and just sort of having my healthy snack. And it all just felt so strange and so disconnected. And when we sat in the hotel at night and we watched the news portrayal of what was happening, that looked so scary and so chaotic. And then we walked outside and we were looking everywhere. Before my yoga class started. And I had been advertising for a new series on the yamas. And so that 1 hour after I landed in Milwaukee, I was teaching on ahimsa, nonviolence. And for me, that moment was like, there is no way really a turning point of like, for me to not talk about the current social and political issues in our country in my class and when I'm talking about like a yogic approach to life, yogic values, and these practices that are meant to help guide our behavior and our understanding when we go out into the world, like it's actually an active act of omission for me to not talk about this.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to share that because it was a huge experience for me, and it's really formulated and given me courage to sort of cross like this this general feeling or like hesitation or fear around how do we address these issues? Will I alienate people? Is it okay for me to talk about what's happening in the world? And to just get really clear about the fact that like this practice isn't calling us into like hesitant and careful omission. It's calling us into full presence.
Totally. Thank you, Kate, for telling that story. That was really inspiring. I want to ask a little question about, I feel like there's a lot of, and me as well as a teacher, I also encounter sometimes this resistance inside me to talk about socio-political things in the classroom, just because, I feel like there's this cultural, we have this kind of culture of practice where people come to yoga often with this desire to shut off. They have the desire to kind of leave that all that negative stuff at the door, and they just want to come to yoga to kind of relax and feel really good about themselves.
shut off that input valve for a little while. One of the things that I am hearing from people right now a lot is the overwhelm of the devastation of the news and kind of like this constant open spigot that is available to us of crisis. And devastation, and that sometimes it is really appropriate to intentionally and mindfully choose for this 1 hour, I am going to actually turn off the input, right, and tune in. And so affirming that is sometimes the right thing.
Right, yeah.
And I also really hear what you're saying of like, it's not the right thing all the time. And the default that our practice is a space just for that recovery is just a selling short of the potential of the practice. And I think for me, like part of what has helped me to start to ditch a little bit of the fear and anxiety around the word politics or the word activism and the conflation with that confrontation is negativity. Because I think that's like a real flattening. And for me, it's helped to sort of redefine for myself what these words mean. And so for me, politics, something that we talked a lot about at Citizen Well over the past year and leading up to the election, is that truly politics is just a system that our society has designed in order to enact our collective values and care for one another. So politics isn't something that came from outside of us. It's intended, democracy is intended to be a system by which we actually elevate the values and the policies that represent our belief in our interdependence and the way that we want to care for one another at a systematic level. And then activism is the process by which we transform that system so that it better reflects our values. So it's like the tweaking. And it's helped me to reclaim that for myself because that lands in my body in a way that I'm like, oh, of course, I want to show up for that. And in fact, the system doesn't work to take care of me or the people that I love or to represent my values if I don't. And so I think it's really useful to consider that the confrontation of taking action to help transform that system so that it works better to represent our values and our enactment of our belief in interdependence is, to me, that's not negativity, that's empowerment.
I'm really glad you said that. I mean, it's that idea of confrontation, what was it you said, confrontation being conflated with negativity? And I do feel like we've lost, there's a certain sense in which I feel like our ability to, and Carol and I were talking a little bit about this, the space of public discourse, and that even being a virtue, and a value, like being able to, and of course it's always an aspiration, because Carol, I was talking about, was there ever a time when we had a real public realm where people were like rationally inquiring into others' points of view? And it's like, no, that never really existed. We're always bringing our affects to the table, right? But there is a sense in which it feels like our ability to communicate and to hold within that communicative space a kind of intensity without needing it, without being traumatized by it, or without letting it play into our own trauma-based reactivity, is something that I feel like a lot of people are challenged with or are struggling with. Do you have any thoughts on how, those of us who are really easily angered by the kind of public discourse, so angered such that like we can't help but feel affronted and like and in a sense violated, maybe almost, by the conversation, how do we go about moving to a place where we can engage without that feeling of resistance and reactivity?
Yeah. That is like the question of this era, because in terms of both the tone of the conversation and the actual news that is happening, like the concrete world events that are happening, that sense of overwhelm and kicked up reactivity and trauma response is like the most rational response. And I think that again just sort of points to like why we need to be bringing these conversations into our practice spaces, because that's where we need the practice the most, is in being able to hold those tough questions of how we show up when we're feeling really activated, is so important. And I also feel that, like, something I like to keep in mind when I don't feel like doing that work, because that is so much work, and it's hard and it's uncomfortable, is to keep in mind, like, who benefits from us not wanting to do that work and just dropping out of the conversation. And what is the consequence of that? And I think we saw that in the fact that we had really low voter turnout this past election, despite having one of the most outrageous and egregious campaigns in U.S. history. There was kind of low voter turnout. And I think that is not symptomatic of the fact that the majority of the country is all in for Trump. I think it's symptomatic of the fact that that people feel overwhelmed and don't feel included in the tone of the conversation, and are therefore disengaged. And I want to just lift up, because I've been, as a young person, I'm turning 30 this year.
Happy birthday.
Woo! I've been asking a lot of elders, Jacob, like most of my adult life has been under an Obama presidency. And so now this shift is happening. And I've been asking elders, is this a historical moment that you have lived through before? Like, and I've heard people say, and even in my own family, I've heard people say, oh, a Republican won, Democrats are being sore losers. You should just, like, if you would have won, you would be gloating too. Get over it, right?
That's what elders are telling you?
No. So a lot of people are saying that, okay?
Yeah.
And feeling like, oh, well, we won, you lost. This is how democracy works. And so the elders that I'm asking is like, is this just what it feels like to have a party that so egregiously doesn't represent your values in power, and this is just normal, and that's how it is? And people are saying, absolutely not. Like, in anyone who's living now's lifetime, they have never seen such a dramatic consolidation of power. The amount of executive orders are being signed, like such a reckless assault on some of our shared values around preserving our planet so we can live here in future generations, around appreciating that immigration and receiving refugees is part of the core identity of this country, economic equality, racial equality, gender equality, that these are values that we have because we respect one another. But they have never seen such a dramatic and quick assault on these values. And so one of my biggest missions in this moment is to tell people that are being told, oh, this is just how it is, to tell them that you're right, that this is not normal. And if you're the person in your friend group that is feeling like, I don't know, like, I kind of feel like we need to do something, and people are sort of telling you to chill out, like, you're right.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. Don't normalize this. Do not normalize this. Yeah. No, I think you're right. It's funny. I was having this conversation a little bit, or mentioning this with Carol. It's like, with Republicans saying, as a tactic, like, Democrats are being partisan. It's like, for them to be nonpartisan in this moment would be to normalize a dramatic shift to something that is so beyond. Right. I mean, for me, I'm a little bit older than you. I'm 33, but I became very politically active during the Bush years, and very angry politically. I would say the most politically intensely I've ever been, up until, now, feeling like it's coming back. But, was in the Bush years. But it's like, I look, and other people I've heard say this, but it's like, I actually feel nostalgia for George W. Bush right now.
Yeah.
It's like, it's so wildly different. It's not the same. It absolutely is not the same. So, you've already transitioned us into what was going to be our next question, and you're very good at that. You're very good at moving the conversation in ways we've agreed to go. You're really good at this organizing, facilitating thing. But I was going to ask you, and so I'll just ask you kind of directly if maybe there's some other things. We're already talking about what is what is what is the condition, what is the situation that we're in? We're already talking about the fact that this is not normal. This is not status quo shift to the Republicans type of scenario, and that we're all like whiny little millennials, pissed that we didn't get our shiny object. No, so do you want to say anything more about that? Just about the situation that we're in? You want to dissect it or diagnose it a little bit more for us?
Yeah. Thank you. So I've been in this conversation a lot just because among my organizing peers and among folks who are getting newly involved politically right now because of what they're seeing, that's really been the question we've been discussing, is that this is an unprecedented moment in U.S. history and certainly in the context of our lifetimes. But it's not a new moment in terms of how governments have shifted internationally. And we can really learn from other countries in terms of how they have responded when their executive branch has accumulated dramatic power, moved really fast, become very xenophobic, very nationalist, very hype about nationalism and American exceptionalism in our case, of saying like our country's the best, and really kind of developing this identity of we're different from the world, we've been taken advantage of, we have to fight for our place again. That these are actually really textbook phenomena that have happened over and over again in the political phenomena of right-wing populism. Yeah. And we can learn from other countries that have dealt with a moment like this and have literally either slipped into periods of having a fascist dictator or not. And that's a really scary thing, but it's also an exciting thing because we are still at this precipice moment where our participation could actually determine that future. It's not a written future. It's not set in stone. And also just because in our lifetime, we've experienced a lot of stability in this country, some of the personal work I've been doing is actually realizing, governments change, empires fall. Why would my moment in history or my physical place in the world be any different? And just coming to terms with a little bit of the fear and honest looking at instability to say, why not America? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And to also feel empowered to say, well, I'm going to get involved. Right. And I think, the last thing I want to say about this is that the thing that feels like both a practical stake and a spiritual stake in this historical moment for me is that the United States is the biggest experiment in multiracial, multinational democracy in the history of the world. There are not other countries that have been founded upon such a clear claim of bringing the huddled masses from all over the world together. And there's a problematic history of how some of those masses got here and whose land this was. Yeah. But yet we have this very multinational country that has been a refuge for many people. And we have people together coming from different cultures, different languages, different skin colors in a way that most countries in the world have never been that textured of a collection. And that's what feels like really a spiritual consequence to me of this moment is, can we prove that this experiment in multiracial democracy can be successful? Can humanity do this? Can we be together and take care of each other without tearing each other apart when we are different? And I think that what's critical about recognizing this moment is that although Trump is like a perfect embodiment of that which threatens that vision, it is also not just about Trump, and that this is a moment for us to build consensus as a society that the systems that allowed a Trump phenomena to happen need reform. And that just the impeachment of Trump will not be enough to make this vision of we can all be together and take care of one another happen. And so that's something that feels deeply at stake for me in these times.
Wow. Such wise words. And thank you for talking especially about the different historical contextual examples of this pattern, because I think that's important to recognize. And there's also something comforting about knowing that this is familiar historically. This isn't something like totally new, and we can gain knowledge and insight from just what you said, looking to these other examples. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's a really important point that we haven't talked about all week. So now, as we start to close our conversation, I want you to talk about maybe, what we can do now. You wanted to offer some tips and maybe some thoughts for, maybe just general people who feel progressive, or, maybe from more of a practice standpoint, whatever you want to offer in terms of moving forward in a kind of engaged direction.
Thank you. Yeah. So one of the things that touches my heart the most is that right now I'm feeling from people, and in myself, as we receive this amount of daily information. I mean, I did a mapping exercise with my friends this past weekend on an organizing retreat, and we mapped out what are the key events that have really polarized the country in the past 6 months. And we had events for every 2 days. Every 2 days. There's been some tweet, there's been international violence, there's been just historic marches that this country has never seen the scale of. I mean, there has been so much changing so fast that I think one of the keys to our survival in this moment is to understand that we have to show up, and there is no way that as individuals or small communities we can show up to every single thing that's happening right now. And so I want to give those who are listening permission to focus. You have full permission to take a look at what's happening, do an inventory of what you feel most passionate about and the skills and access and energy that you're bringing to the table, and to pick a place to focus and know that your contribution is part of a huge tapestry of contributions that hopefully will address the scale of the need, but that as an individual, it is not your role to address the scale of the need. And that is something I need to hear all the time. And so I want to offer a couple just really clear action steps that are options. If you're cool, permission to focus on what? A couple of options for you to add to things that you might already have in mind in your local community. So the first one is, I just want to encourage you in whatever context you're in to speak up. One of my housemates is a brilliant restorative yoga teacher, and she talked about overhearing at the studio kind of the exact same thing that you were mentioning earlier, Jacob, of students in the hallway kind of putting their shoes on and chatting about one student that was chatting about oh yeah, I don't talk about any of that political stuff because it's just negativity, and sort of my contribution is to just be positive, and that's going to shift the energy of the country. And she felt really scared to join the conversation. And she debriefed later, I wish I would have, even if awkwardly and not perfectly, I wish I would have said something just to weigh in that, a part of this practice is showing up to what's happening in our world, and that it isn't enough. One of the quotes from Frederick Douglass is, I prayed and prayed, but I didn't receive an answer until I prayed with my legs. And that part of our practice is showing up to create that change that we are also contributing to through our spiritual practice, but that we need our legs too.
That's so good. So, pray with your legs.
Yes. So I just want to encourage folks to however awkwardly and imperfectly, to start speaking up. And then the second thing is to get into community. So when we think about the scale of what's happening, there is so much to consider. We need to be together if we are going to come up with good ideas. We're going to need each other, and we're going to need each other for ongoing encouragement, challenge, emotional support, to understand how what's happening is affecting the people in our community. We cannot do this by checking our Facebook every day and calling our legislators by ourselves. I'm here to tell you 6 months from now, you're going to be way too exhausted to do that if you don't get with some friends. So The Women's March has put out this super awesome facilitator guide that they're calling a huddle, and they're making a call for everyone around the country to huddle up during the month of February. They have this guide written out, so if you're like, I want to do it, I'll invite some friends over to my house, we'll have a potluck, but I have no clue how to start this conversation. Their guide is really sweet, and I think for those of us who are practicing the yamas and niyamas will find it really quite aligned with our values.
Wow.
And so we'll put the link for that in the comments so you can download that guide and get people together. And then just the last thing I want to invite you to do is continue to seek places where you can get more education about how to get more engaged, because like we mentioned before, this is a phenomena that is unique to our place and time, but also not unique in terms of how political change happens in the world. And so there is some skill and learning that is required in terms of what strategy will work to really protect our values and protect each other in these times. And so I encourage you to seek out places where you can learn, either at local organizations that might be offering trainings or actions in your community. And I also want to invite you, if it's accessible to you, to come to the Yoga Service Council in May, where on the Friday I'm collaborating with some colleagues to run a pre-conference intensive that is exactly about how we show up politically and as activists in these times as yoga practitioners.
Wow, that's amazing. And where can people find information about that?
So you can look up the Yoga Service Council Conference, and we'll also put the link in the comments as well.
Okay, great. Where is that taking place at?
It's at Omega Institute.
Oh, perfect. Cool.
Yeah, in May 19th to the 21st.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so those are a couple options to start with. We'll put them all in the comments so you can click through and find what you can, find something you can focus on, and begin.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Kate. Wow, what a wonderful conversation. So if you have any questions for Kate, again, everything that we mentioned just here at the end as resources we'll put in the comments of this post. And if you want to ask Kate any questions, you can leave those questions in the comments, and I'll make sure she sees them so she can respond. And Kate, how else can people get a hold of you? Do you have a website? Do you want to give?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So you can find me at katewerning.com. And on Facebook, I also have a page called Kate Werning Yoga, where, as true to my story at the beginning, I am constantly kind of integrating this moment in our world, how we're showing up and how it relates to our yoga practice, as openly and transparently as I can through a Facebook page. And I would love to keep in touch.
Awesome. Yeah. So check that out, and we'll put that in the comments as well, maybe a link to your website. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Kate. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.